A once-in-a-lifetime love. For Ethan and Evan Carter, life had always been a reflection in the mirror. Born only minutes apart, they had spent their entire lives side by side. Same schools, same hobbies, even the same group of friends. People often joked that they shared a single soul in two bodies, and in many ways, it felt true. Growing up in the quiet town of Brookdale, the twins were inseparable. Their parents, Mark and Linda Carter, had learned early on that trying to separate them was pointless. If one got into trouble, the other was right there beside him. If one wanted to play soccer, the other suddenly became just as passionate about the sport. Their bond was so strong that even their first serious heartbreak happened at the same time. Ethan and Evan had fallen for twin sisters in high school, only to have their young love end when the girl's family moved away. That experience had left them with an unshakable belief. If they ever fell in love again, it had to be with someone who understood their bond. And then fate intervened. An unbelievable coincidence. It was a summer afternoon when they first met Isabella and Ivy Thompson. The brothers had just finished a gym session and decided to grab coffee at a nearby cafe. Evan had nudged Ethan as they walked in. "Check out the twins over there," he whispered. At first, Ethan thought his brother was joking, but then he saw them. Two stunning women sitting by the window, engaged in deep conversation. They were mirror images of each other, just like he and Evan. Their golden brown hair cascaded over their shoulders in loose waves, and their eyes, a shade of deep hazel, sparkled in the sunlight. Even their mannerisms were eerily synchronized, sipping their iced coffees at the same time, laughing in perfect unison. Ethan and Evan exchanged a look. This was too much of a coincidence. "Are we dreaming?" Ethan murmured. "Only one way to find out." Evan smirked before confidently walking up to them. "Excuse me," he said, flashing his signature grin. "But are we looking at some kind of parallel universe?" The sisters looked up in surprise, and then their faces broke into amused smiles. "Well, this is a first," Isabella chuckled. "You're twins too." "We like to think of ourselves as an upgraded model," Ethan joked, making the girls laugh. As they talked, they discovered an uncanny number of similarities. Isabella and Ivy had also been inseparable their whole lives. They had attended the same university, studied the same major, and even worked at the same law firm. Their childhood stories mirrored the Carter brothers so much that it felt surreal. That afternoon turned into hours of laughter and conversation. By the time they left the cafe, they had exchanged numbers, knowing deep down that this meeting was more than just chance, the perfect match. Over the next few months, the four of them were inseparable. Ethan and Isabella had an instant connection. Both were pragmatic, logical, and career-driven. They balanced each other out, grounding their relationship in deep conversations and shared goals. Evan and Ivy, on the other hand, were the free spirits. They were adventurous, spontaneous, and full of energy. Where Ethan and Isabella preferred structure, Evan and Ivy thrived on unpredictability. It wasn't long before love blossomed between them. The world around them faded whenever they were together. Everything just clicked. So when Ethan proposed to Isabella and Evan proposed to Ivy, on the same night, under the same starlit sky, it felt like destiny. Their double wedding was a spectacle the town of Brookdale had never seen before, a breathtaking ceremony in a vast garden, with matching wedding dresses and tuxedos, and a crowd that marveled at how surreal it all was. Guests whispered about how rare it was to see two sets of identical twins marrying each other. Some even joked that their future children would be genetic copies of each other. As the couples exchanged vows, Ethan squeezed Isabella's hand and whispered, "This is fate, isn't it?" She smiled, her eyes shining. It always was. A harmonious life. Until now. Married life was nothing short of magical. The Carters and the Thompsons, now one big family, moved into neighboring houses, making sure their lives remained as intertwined as before. Every morning, they had breakfast together. Every weekend, they planned trips, hikes, or lazy movie nights. Friends often joked that they were living in their own little twin bubble, one that no one else could fully understand. And yet, as perfect as everything seemed, fate had one last twist waiting for them. It all started with a simple decision, one that would forever change their lives. They wanted children. Ethan and Isabella were the first to bring it up one evening over dinner. "We've been married for a year now," Isabella said, glancing at Ethan with a smile. "Maybe it's time to expand the family." Ethan and Ivy exchanged glances, grinning. "We were actually thinking the same thing," Ivy admitted. Excitement filled the air. The thought of their children growing up as closely as they had was a dream come true. And just like everything else in their lives, it happened in perfect synchrony. Within a few months, both sisters were pregnant. The town buzzed with excitement when they found out. Twins marrying twins, having babies at the same time. That's a miracle, people would say. The couples reveled in the joy, decorating nurseries, reading parenting books, and making endless plans for their future children. They imagined playdates, family vacations, and birthdays celebrated together. Everything was perfect, until the day the babies were born. A moment of pure joy, then confusion. It was a surreal moment when both sisters went into labor on the same day. Ethan paced the hospital hallway, his heart racing. In the room next to him, Ethan was doing the same. Their parents, overjoyed but anxious, watched as both brothers kept glancing at the clock. Then, almost like a scene from a movie, the doctors emerged at the same time. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. You have a beautiful baby boy." "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. You have a gorgeous baby girl." Tears of joy streamed down their faces. They rushed into their respective rooms to hold their newborns for the first time. But as the doctors checked the babies over, a strange silence settled over the room. The medical staff exchanged uneasy glances. Then one doctor cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, we need to run a few additional tests." Ethan and Evan frowned. "Why? Is something wrong?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "We just need to verify something. It's just unusual." The room went cold. Isabella and Ivy, still exhausted from labor, looked at each other in concern. "What do you mean?" Ivy whispered. The doctor sighed, carefully choosing his words. "We noticed something in both babies' genetic markers that requires further testing." Ethan's stomach tightened. "What kind of markers?" The doctor hesitated again, then said something that sent a chill down their spines. "They are identical in a way that shouldn't be possible." The shocking truth begins to unfold. The hospital room, which had moments ago been filled with pure joy, now stood frozen in uneasy silence. Ethan and Evan exchanged glances, their excitement slowly giving way to confusion. Isabella and Ivy, still lying in their hospital beds, gripped their newborns tighter, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Ethan cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, but could you repeat that?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "Your children, both of them, share an identical genetic profile that isn't typical for cousins. They're more like siblings." A deep, unsettling stillness took over the room. "What?" Isabella's voice was barely above a whisper. "That's impossible." "It's certainly unusual," the doctor admitted. "But scientifically, the results suggest that your children are not just cousins, they are genetically identical siblings." Ethan let out a nervous chuckle. "That doesn't make any sense. Ethan and I are identical twins, and Isabella and Ivy are identical twins. It's natural for our kids to be closely related, but how can they be identical siblings?" The doctor nodded, clearly expecting this reaction. "You're correct in thinking your children would be genetically similar, more than typical cousins, of course. However, the degree of similarity we're seeing is something else entirely." He hesitated. "We'd like to run further tests to confirm, but initial results indicate that the children may have inherited DNA as if they were born to the same set of parents." Isabella's grip tightened on her newborn son. Her mind swirled with the implications. But we are two different couples. We conceived separately. We. She looked desperately at her husband, who seemed just as bewildered. Ethan swallowed hard. What are you trying to say? That we're not actually the fathers of our own kids? The doctor sighed. No, you are their biological fathers. But the way the genes have aligned, it's as if your children were conceived by one single couple, rather than two separate ones. The words sent a chill through the room. The science behind the shock. As disbelief settled over them, another doctor stepped in. This time, a genetic specialist. She introduced herself as Dr. Lillian Carter, no relation to them, but clearly an expert in her field. I understand this is difficult to process, she said, adjusting her glasses. But let me try to explain it in simpler terms. She pulled out a chart. Identical twins share 100% of their DNA because they come from the same fertilized egg that splits into two embryos. Normally, when twins have children separately, those children are about as genetically similar as full siblings rather than just cousins. Ethan and Even nodded slowly, following so far. But in your case, Dr. Carter continued, since both sets of parents are identical twins, the genetic material aligns in a way that creates virtual clones of the same DNA. It's called quaternary twins, a very rare phenomenon. Quaternary twins? Ivy asked, her voice trembling. Yes, though your children were carried by different mothers, they are genetically identical, as if one set of parents had both of them. The words echoed through their minds, and suddenly, the reality of what this meant struck them like a lightning bolt. Their children weren't just cousins. They were genetically indistinguishable from full siblings. An unseen consequence of their unusual love. The revelation sent shockwaves through the hospital room. I don't understand, Isabella muttered, her hands shaking as she cradled her baby. Is this dangerous? Are there any risks? Dr. Carter hesitated before shaking her head. No, there's nothing biologically wrong with your children. They're perfectly healthy. It's just an incredibly rare genetic circumstance. But what does this mean for our family? Even asked, running a hand through his hair. Are we supposed to treat them like cousins or siblings? What happens when they grow up and realize they're more than just cousins? Dr. Carter pursed her lips. That's something you'll have to decide as a family. While this is rare, there have been a few documented cases. It mostly comes down to how you choose to navigate the social and emotional aspects of this revelation. A heavy silence followed. For the first time in their lives, Ethan and Even felt truly lost. For Isabella and Ivy, the thought of explaining this to their children one day sent a wave of anxiety crashing over them. What would people say? Would their children be treated differently? A secret to keep or a truth to share? That night, the hospital room remained dimly lit as the new parents sat in stunned silence, their babies sleeping soundly in their arms. I don't know what to do, Isabella admitted, finally breaking the silence. Do we tell them? When they're older? We have to, Ethan said firmly. It's their right to know. But what if it confuses them? What if it makes them feel different? Ivy whispered. Even exhaled sharply. They are different, but not in a bad way. This doesn't change the fact that we love them. It just means our family is even more unique than we thought. The words were meant to be reassuring, but none of them could shake the unease settling in their chests. The start of an uncertain future. The following weeks were filled with mixed emotions. On the surface, everything seemed normal, joyful, even. Family and friends visited to celebrate the birth of the twins' children. Gifts poured in, smiles were exchanged, and life carried on. But behind closed doors, an unspoken tension loomed. Ethan and Even spent nights researching quaternary twins, trying to find similar stories. There were a handful of cases documented, but none of them provided clear guidance on how to navigate this strange reality. Isabella and Ivy, meanwhile, worried about how this would affect their children growing up. Would it change how people saw them? Would it make them feel out of place in a world where traditional family structures were the norm? Then came the unexpected question from Isabella's mother during a family dinner. "Have you thought about what last names the babies will have?" she asked casually, sipping her tea. Since they're so closely related, it might be fun to give them a hyphenated name that represents both families equally. The question sent a ripple of unease through the room. A simple detail, something they should have easily decided, now felt like an overwhelming choice. Would they raise them as cousins, siblings, something in between? It was only the beginning of a long, complicated journey ahead. And deep down, they all knew this was only the first of many difficult conversations they would have to face. The weight of the truth. The days following the twins' births were supposed to be filled with joy, late-night feedings, and the typical exhaustion that came with being new parents. Instead, Ethan, Evan, Isabella, and Ivy found themselves drowning in questions they had no answers to. The more they tried to process what had happened, the heavier the truth became. Their children, born to two separate mothers, were not just cousins. They were genetic siblings. And the weight of that realization was suffocating. A rift in the family. One evening, as the twins' families gathered for a small celebration at Ethan and Isabella's home, the tension was impossible to ignore. Ethan's mother, Margaret, was the first to speak up. "Have you two decided how you'll explain this to the children when they're older?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. The four parents exchanged glances. The truth was, they hadn't. They had spent hours discussing it behind closed doors, but every conversation ended in uncertainty. "We haven't figured it out yet," Ethan admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. Evan quickly jumped in. "But we'll tell them when they're old enough to understand." Margaret sighed, setting down her teacup. "That's easier said than done. Children start asking questions early. How will you explain why they look exactly alike? Why they feel a stronger connection than other cousins?" Their father, James, cleared his throat. "I think the bigger question is, are you going to raise them as siblings or as cousins?" Silence. Isabella and Ivy exchanged nervous glances. "They are cousins," Isabella finally said, though the words felt forced. "Technically, they're not," James countered. "You may have given birth to them separately, but genetically speaking, they are as much siblings as if they had been born from the same mother." Ivy shifted uncomfortably. "But raising them as siblings, wouldn't that confuse them even more?" Margaret sighed. "Confusing or not, they'll figure it out eventually. They'll see their reflection in each other and know something is different." Ethan swallowed hard. His mother was right. No matter how much they wanted to pretend this was normal, it wasn't. And that was just the beginning of their problems. The birth certificate dilemma. A week later, the hospital called. Dr. Carter, the geneticist, wanted them to come in for a follow-up. The four of them sat in her office, the fluorescent lights above casting an almost eerie glow. Dr. Carter folded her hands on the desk and sighed. "There's something we need to discuss regarding your children's birth records." Evan frowned. "What do you mean?" "Well," she hesitated. "Because of their unique genetic makeup, the hospital system flagged them as a possible error. Their DNA profile doesn't match the expected genetic differences between cousins. The system essentially thinks they are the result of, well, a mistake in record-keeping." Ivy's heart dropped. "A mistake? What kind of mistake?" Dr. Carter adjusted her glasses. "To put it bluntly, the system assumes there was an error in recording the biological parents. Since Ethan and Evan have identical DNA, and Isabella and Ivy have identical DNA, the system believes the children were conceived by the same couple rather than two separate ones." A heavy silence filled the room. Ethan clenched his jaw. "So what does that mean?" Dr. Carter hesitated again. "It means the state is requiring additional documentation before finalizing their birth certificates. They want proof of which father is biologically linked to which child." Evan's eyes widened. "Wait, why does that even matter?" Dr. Carter pursed her lips. "Because legally speaking, if we can't differentiate their parentage, the system will assume both children belong to one set of parents. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Are you saying that one of us might not be legally recognized as our own child's parent? Dr. Carter nodded slowly. Exactly. The room spun. Ivy gripped her husband's arm. This is ridiculous. We know who the parents are. Dr. Carter sighed. I believe you. But the legal system doesn't deal in belief. It deals in evidence. And genetically, the evidence is too identical to distinguish one set of parents from the other. Ethan's hands curled into fists. So what do we do? Dr. Carter handed them a stack of paperwork. You'll need to petition for legal clarification. That means a judge will have to determine how to assign parentage on official records. Until then, the hospital cannot finalize the birth certificates. The world felt like it was collapsing around them. A family under scrutiny. As the legal process began, word of their situation somehow spread beyond their immediate family. It started as whispers in their town, but soon, the local journalist caught wind of their story. One evening, Isabella answered a knock at their door, only to find a reporter standing there, microphone in hand. Mrs. Carter, is it true that your child and your sister's child are genetically the same? Isabella's heart pounded. Who told you that? The reporter smiled. We received a tip from someone at the hospital. This is a remarkable case, something the public would be fascinated to hear about. She took a step back. We're not interested in sharing our private lives. The reporter, unfazed, pressed on. Do you think your children should be raised as siblings instead of cousins? There are experts debating this online. What's your stance? Isabella slammed the door in his face. She turned around to see Ethan standing in the hallway, his face pale. This is getting out of hand, he murmured. And he was right. When the internet finds out, within days, social media exploded with discussions about their case. Some people were fascinated. Others were horrified. Are these kids going to be confused growing up? One person tweeted, "This is exactly why twins shouldn't marry twins." Another comment read, "They should be legally considered siblings, not cousins. Biology doesn't lie. They should just tell the kids the truth and let them decide." Ethan and Evan tried to ignore it. Isabella and Ivy stayed off social media entirely. But the damage was done. Their private struggle was now public, and the court hearing was only days away. The judge's decision. The courtroom was small, but the weight of the moment was massive. A judge sat before them, sifting through the genetic reports, the medical records, and the petition for parentage clarification. Finally, he spoke. This is indeed a unique case. The legal system was not designed with quaternary twins in mind. However, after careful consideration, I am ruling as follows. Everyone held their breath. The children will retain their originally assigned last names. However, due to the indistinguishable genetic markers, both sets of parents will be granted equal legal guardianship over both children. The word sent a shockwave through them. What does that mean? Ivy asked. The judge looked at them seriously. It means that while you are free to raise them as cousins, legally, both sets of parents have equal parental rights over both children. The room went silent. The reality of what that meant settled in. In the eyes of the law, their family was not just two separate households. They were one. What comes next? As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Questions were shouted, microphones were shoved in their faces. But all Ethan, Isabella, and Ivy could think about was what now? Would they raise their children as cousins or siblings? Would they ever truly escape the scrutiny? And most importantly, would their children ever understand the complexity of the truth they had been born into? The journey was far from over. It had only just begun. A family redefined. The judge's ruling had changed everything. Ethan, Isabella, and Ivy had expected some complications, but they hadn't imagined they would legally become equal parents to both children. It wasn't just a bureaucratic ruling. It was a reality that reshaped their entire family dynamic. For the next few days, the weight of the decision settled over their home like an unshakable fog. What did it mean to be equal legal parents? Would they have to co-parent in a way that blurred the lines between their households? And more importantly, how would their children, too young to understand any of this now, perceive their relationship when they were old enough to ask questions? The divide grows. Tension began creeping into their once close relationships. What had once felt like a seamless bond between two sets of twins, built on an unbreakable foundation of love and trust, now felt fragile. One evening, Isabella and Ivy sat in the kitchen, their tea growing cold as they talked in hushed voices. "This is insane," Ivy muttered, staring at the legal paperwork on the table. "I mean, I love your son, Izzy, but how am I supposed to see him as mine the way I see my own child?" Isabella sighed. "I know. I feel the same way. It's just unnatural." Ivy looked up sharply. "Do you think we should fight it? Appeal the ruling?" A long silence stretched between them. "I don't know," Isabella admitted. "But what if? What if fighting it makes things worse?" Ivy's expression darkened. "Worse than this." Meanwhile, Ethan and Even were having a similar conversation in the living room, their voices tense. "I don't care what the law says," Ethan muttered, pacing the floor. "That's my son. I was there when he was born. I saw him take his first breath." Even leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And you think I don't feel the same way about mine? But the court doesn't care about how we feel. Legally, we're in this together now, whether we like it or not." Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "So what do we do? Share parenting responsibilities? Have some sort of weird rotating schedule?" Even's jaw clenched. "I don't know, man. But whatever happens, we can't let this tear us apart." Whispers and judgment. As if their internal struggles weren't enough, the outside world had become relentless. The media storm had only grown, with their story being picked up by larger news networks. It wasn't just a local curiosity anymore. It was a national debate. Podcasts discussed it. Talk shows analyzed it. Psychologists weighed in on what this could mean for child development. And the online comments were ruthless. "This is so wrong. Those poor kids are going to grow up so confused. Twins marrying twins is already weird, but this is unnatural. Legally making them both parents. The government is out of control. Honestly, this could be a new form of family. Maybe they're just ahead of their time." The discussions weren't just happening online. At the grocery store, neighbors whispered behind their backs. At the pediatrician's office, the nurse hesitated before calling their last names, unsure how to address them. And at family gatherings, even their closest relatives looked at them with uncertainty. "You're making things harder than they need to be," their uncle, Richard, said bluntly at a family dinner. Ethan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Richard leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're trying so hard to fight biology and legality at the same time. Just raise them as siblings. It's the simplest way to handle this." A heavy silence settled over the room. Ivy shook her head. "They're not siblings. We carried them separately. We gave birth to them separately." Richard shrugged. "And yet, scientifically speaking, they are." The debate had no end. No matter how hard they tried to hold on to normalcy, the world around them refused to let them. The breaking point. Things came to a head one evening when Isabella and Ivy had an argument that would change everything. It started over something small: who was responsible for taking the kids to a routine checkup. But underneath that simple question lay all the tension that had been building for months. "I told you, I already made the appointment," Isabella snapped. "And I told you, I think we should go together," Ivy shot back. "It's not necessary. We don't have to do everything, as if we're one big weird polygamous family." Ivy's eyes flashed. "Is that what you think this is? Some weird situation? We didn't ask for this, Izzy. We didn't choose this." Isabella crossed her arms. "Then maybe we should stop playing along with it." Ivy's face paled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we should just stop this whole shared parenting thing. Go back to the way things should be. Silence. Ivy's voice was barely above a whisper. You mean, pretend my son isn't yours? Isabella swallowed hard. I mean, maybe we should legally fight for sole custody of our own kids. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate, and then Ivy turned and walked out of the house without another word. The decision that changed everything. The next few weeks were filled with sleepless nights and difficult conversations. Ethan and Evan tried to find common ground, but the rift between Isabella and Ivy made it nearly impossible. A court appeal seemed inevitable. Until one night, everything changed. It was 2 a.m. when Ethan and Isabella were jolted awake by a phone call. It was Evan. His voice was trembling. Come to the hospital. Now. Their hearts dropped. They barely had time to register the words before they threw on clothes and rushed out the door. A mother's worst nightmare. When they arrived at the hospital, they found Ivy sitting in a chair, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. Evan stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. And in a small hospital bed nearby was Ivy's son, their nephew. His tiny body was hooked up to monitors, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Isabella's heart stopped. What happened? Ivy wiped at her tears. He had trouble breathing in the middle of the night. He wouldn't stop crying, and then he just went limp. Her voice broke. The doctors say it was a severe allergic reaction. If we hadn't brought him in when we did. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Isabella felt her own tears start to fall. And in that moment, everything else, the court battles, the debates, the whispers, disappeared. All that mattered was family. She moved closer, placing a hand over Ivy's. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Ivy squeezed her hand tightly. I don't care about the court anymore. I don't care about the legal stuff. I just want him to be okay. Ethan and Evan looked at each other and nodded. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Because no matter what the law said, no matter what the world thought, these children were theirs. And they would fight for them. Together. A fragile hope. The sterile scent of antiseptics clung to the hospital air, the rhythmic beeping of monitors filling the room like an anxious heartbeat. Ivy sat beside her son's bed, her hands trembling as she brushed a stray curl from his forehead. His tiny chest rose and fell, his breath steadier than before, but fear still gripped her. Isabella stood across from her, arms wrapped around herself. The fight, the legal battles, the endless media storm, it all seemed so small now. Evan was the first to speak, his voice rough with exhaustion. The doctor said he's stable now, but they need to keep him for observation. They think it was an undiagnosed food allergy. Ethan nodded solemnly. Did they figure out what caused it? Ivy swallowed hard. The formula. The one we just switched to last week. She exhaled sharply, her voice barely above a whisper. If I had just noticed sooner. Don't do that to yourself, Isabella said softly. You caught it in time. That's what matters. But Ivy didn't look convinced. Her eyes flickered to Isabella's son, sleeping in Evan's arms across the room. What if it was him next time? The weight of those words settled heavily between them. What if? A family fractured. The hospital stay forced them into uncomfortable truths. Over the next 2 days, as Ivy's son slowly recovered, the 4 of them rotated shifts at the hospital, taking turns watching over him. At night, Isabella sat awake beside Ivy, both of them silently watching their children sleep. Neither of them wanted to admit it, but they were at a crossroads. The court ruling had dictated their shared parenting, but was that really what was best for the children? Ivy had always been the most vocal about her discomfort with the arrangement, and after this scare, her stance only hardened. They need clear boundaries, she murmured one evening, her voice thick with exhaustion. Isabella turned to her, confused. What do you mean? Ivy hesitated before meeting her sister's gaze. We can't keep pretending this is normal. The kids are going to grow up confused. And what happens when one of them gets sick again? How do we make medical decisions? Who gets the final say? A lump formed in Isabella's throat. I thought we were past this. I thought we were too, Ivy admitted. But now, I don't know. Their silence stretched for too long, and Isabella felt something break inside her. Were they really about to let this tear them apart? A painful proposal. When they finally left the hospital, an unspoken tension followed them home. The next evening, they gathered in the living room, their children sleeping soundly in their cribs. We need to talk, Ivy said, her tone carefully measured. Ethan and Evan exchanged glances before nodding. I've been thinking, she continued, that maybe we should go back to court. Fight the ruling. Get sole custody. Isabella flinched. You're serious? Ivy nodded. I love your son, Izzy, and I know you love mine, but we can't go on like this. It's not sustainable. Ethan's jaw tightened. So what? We just pretend this never happened. Cut each other off. Of course not, Ivy said quickly. But we need to redefine what this family is. The way it stands now, it's too complicated. We need to separate our households legally. Evan's voice was low, tense. Do you really think that's best for the kids? I do, Ivy said, and for the first time in weeks, she sounded certain. Isabella stared at her sister, searching for hesitation, but found none. Her own mind warred against itself. A part of her agreed, but another part of her was terrified of what that would mean. Are we sure about this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ivy's eyes softened. I think it's time we stop letting a legal technicality dictate our lives. A hard decision. The decision didn't come easily. Over the next few weeks, they met with lawyers, drafted new custody agreements, and prepared for what was sure to be another drawn-out legal process. The media attention had died down somewhat, but reporters still sniffed around for updates, eager for any new development in the twins and the switched baby story. Even, ever the peacemaker, tried to hold things together. No matter what happens in court, we don't have to let this destroy our relationship, he reminded them. Ethan wasn't so sure. That depends on how ugly this gets. And it did get ugly. The lawyers were ruthless. The custody battle forced them to relive every painful moment. Who was the better parent? Who was more financially stable? Who was more emotionally fit to raise a child? Isabella and Ivy, once inseparable, now sat on opposite sides of a courtroom. The verdict. The judge listened carefully to their case. Unlike last time, there was no groundbreaking scientific discovery, no shocking twist to sway the court. This time, it came down to one simple thing: what was best for the children. After weeks of arguments, hearings, and emotional turmoil, the ruling was final. Each twin would be granted sole custody of the child they had physically given birth to. The legal ties between the families were severed. The aftermath. When the ruling was read, Isabella felt empty. She had fought for this, agreed to this, but now that it was reality, it felt like a loss rather than a victory. She glanced at Ivy, expecting to see relief, but instead saw the same emptiness reflected in her eyes. After the courtroom emptied, they stood together in silence. I thought I'd feel better, Ivy admitted. Isabella swallowed past the lump in her throat. Me too. They had won. They had gotten exactly what they wanted. So why did it feel like they had lost something much bigger? The new normal. The weeks that followed were filled with adjustments. They were no longer legally bound by the court's previous ruling, but they still had to figure out how to function as a family. Would they still celebrate birthdays together? Would they still call each other in the middle of the night when something was wrong? Would their children ever truly understand the complexity of their origins? Ethan and Evan struggled with the transition. It feels like we're pretending we're not all still family, Evan admitted one evening. Ethan sighed. We are. But we also have to respect the boundaries they wanted. For Ivy and Isabella, the hardest part was letting go, not just of the legal ties, but of the unbreakable connection they had shared all their lives. Some days, they wished they had fought harder to make the situation work. Other days, they felt relief that they had taken control of their fate. But the one thing they both knew for certain: no ruling, no law, could ever truly separate them. Because at the end of the day, no matter what the world called them, they were still twins. And that bond could never be broken.